Hi everyone, and welcome to the last session of what has been a big and incredible day at the conference, starting with a really extraordinary song from Cree singer Rosalie Spence when we welcomed Tantu Cardinal this morning. I would like to begin by acknowledging that today's events are taking place on the treaty territory of the Mississaugas of New Credit and the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Huron-Wendat. We are grateful to have the opportunity to work in the community. A bit of housekeeping before we get going. Please remember that no professional photography or video recording is allowed inside the studio. However, not to worry because we are live streaming the conference to our website and to our YouTube channel. A warm welcome to our audiences tuning in online. And please do tweet and keep the conversation going with our online audience using hashtag TIFF18. This afternoon's MOGULS session is supported by Betty Ann Heggie, who is a TIFF board member, a tremendous advocate for women in the industry, and who has been with us right from the outset with our Share Her Journey initiative. And I really do want to add my own personal thanks to Betty Ann, who has been consistently encouraging to me and my team, and just so wholeheartedly getting behind everything that TIFF is trying to achieve in the areas of equity and diversity. Betty Ann Heggie, everyone. After the session, we would love to invite you to join us for happy hour drinks in the lobby, generously sponsored by Rotten Tomatoes. Or tomatoes, I should say. And no, I'm not an Aussie, I'm a Kiwi. So, we couldn't be more delighted to close today with a keynote from Dr. Stacy L. Smith, founder and director of the USC Annenberg Inclusion Initiative, who was here with us at TIFF 2 years ago talking about the 4% and raising awareness of gender parity. She has been an outspoken leader in this debate. And earlier this year, when Best Actress Oscar winner Frances McDormand whispered "inclusion rider" in her Oscar acceptance speech, millions of home viewers pulled out their mobile phones and started Googling the phrase. Well, Dr. Smith knew exactly what it meant because she invented the concept with Washington attorney Kalpana Kotagal. In a landscape peppered with strong views and opinions, what really sets Dr. Smith apart is her diligent capturing, her authoritative analysis, and her intelligent presentation of data. For there is no denying the persuasive power of hard facts. And now she's back at TIFF to talk about the importance of diversity in film criticism and how a singular lens has been dominating the reviews we've read for decades, directly impacting what audiences choose to see. Dr. Smith will present her latest groundbreaking research, and then she'll be joined on stage by a panel of journalists. Jacqueline Coley, the new film editor at Rotten Tomatoes, freelance film critic Valerie Complex, the president of the African American Film Critics Association, Gil Robertson, deputy editor of Mashable, Angie Han, for a conversation that will be moderated by the Blacklist's Franklin Leonard. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Dr. Stacy Smith.
TIFF. A couple of words of caution before I begin. I'll pronounce tomatoes, so I don't want to let you down. Secondly, we mentioned those two little words that, turned a few things upside down, the inclusion writer, and I just want to mention the third co-author that I don't think was mentioned, Fanchen Cox-Diagiovanni, as well. And third, as always, my data are highly depressing and I move really fast, so I'm sorry ahead of time. I'm here today to talk about a new project, which we're calling Critic's Choice 2, the sequel. And what we have been looking at the Annenberg Inclusion Initiative at USC is we're really trying to understand the entire ecosystem of entertainment when it comes to issues of inclusion. So whether we're focusing on research, advocacy, or action, our goal is to really paint a picture of diversity and inclusion and the North Star, which is belonging, what really happens from the executive ranks all the way through every speaking character above and below the line, and now our second study in the film criticism space. So let me tell you a little bit about what we did for this second investigation. And one last public service announcement before I begin for any press in the room. The first author of this investigation, Mark Schweedy, is in the front row. If you have any questions, please direct them to Mark or myself afterwards. Okay, in terms of what we did for this second study is we conducted a little study that we put out in June looking at the top 100 films of 2017 and film reviews. What we did is we went back and we wanted to see if 2017 was anomalous or if there had been any changes over time. So what we did is we looked at 59,751 film reviews over the last 3 years, the top 300 grossing films from 2015 to 2017. What we did is we were interested in these film reviews in a couple of different respects. We wanted to know any appreciable change over time, how are studios and studios and publication outlets implicated in the findings, and third and finally, do critics' identity when they're reviewing different types of films with different lead characters, does this affect how reviewers evaluate them when it comes to review scores on Rotten Tomatoes? So what we did here is we looked at 3 different units of analysis, and I'll refer to these in the presentation. We looked at the review level. That's the 59,000 plus number. We looked at the critic level. All reviewers really boil down, or all reviews really boil down to about 2,400 different individual people that are writing across the top 300 films. And because we've done research on the top grossing films over the last 11 years, we were actually able to marry these data sets to say, how does lead character and critic identity intersect to affect review scores? Every review was evaluated in a couple of different ways. Some of these I've already mentioned. The demographics of the reviewer, all those details are found in the report, the distributor, the publication venue, and the review score. So what did we find? Our first question to frame the second investigation was, what is the demographic profile of film critics? Here we're going to start with the reviews. Now, if you look across those 59,000 plus reviews, you will see a very common story from what we published a few months ago. I promise, depressing, I'm delivering. In terms of females, looking at the top row, only 21% of the reviews on Rotten Tomatoes were written or authored by female reviewers. If we jump to underrepresented reviewers, that number drops to 16.8%. Now, interestingly, this is about a 4-to-1 ratio for gender, 5-to-1 ratio for race ethnicity. Now, what's really interesting here is if we drop down another row, we see a relatively stable number of top critics that are females, but the underrepresented number dips down to 12%. One important caveat I need to mention about these findings: there were no differences by year. There were no differences from 2015 through 2017 in the variability of these findings. Now, what's really important here is we've treated gender and race ethnicity separately. In the next slide, it was important to cross these measures and to look intersectionally at how different groups are faring in the film criticism space. Again, focusing on all reviewers. And here, the major finding is that women of color are written off as critics. A full 66% of all reviewers are white male critics, but less than 4% are underrepresented female critics. And as you can see on your far right, this is a 62% decline between these two groups. And these two groups we are going to revisit time and time again in the remaining 9 minutes that I have. Now, when we turn to individual critics, so we've been looking at reviews, now let's look at the critics themselves. And here, we're really interested in those individuals and proportions that they hold across these 4 identities. And what we see here is there are major demographic disparities among critics. When we look at the individuals, about 53% are white males, and only 9% are underrepresented females. Now, if you're tweeting, this next slide becomes really important. We can contextualize the problem quite succinctly on this next graphic. When you think about the total reviewing process, particularly of top critics, the ratio of white male top critics reviews to underrepresented female top critics reviews is 31 to 1. A demographic disparity that should not exist. Now, as we do in all our other work with on-screen and behind the camera, we did an invisibility analysis. And we were very interested in how women of color have been erased from the critical review process across these top films. And this invisibility analysis, in particular, focuses on underrepresented women as top critics who do not get to participate in reviewing across the most lucrative motion pictures. If we take a look at the top 300 films from 2015 to 2017, a full 48% of those 300 films erase women of color from the critics' pool. If we take a look at the 108 female-driven films in the sample, films with leads, co-leads, ensemble casts that pull female, 45% do not have a woman of color reviewing those movies. And finally, if we look at underrepresented leads across 300 films, which there are 57 films with an underrepresented lead, 35% do not have a woman of color in the critics' pool as a top critic. So we're seeing erasure in the director's chair, erasure on screen in terms of speaking characters and leading characters, and erasure in the film criticism space. Now, the 2 last questions are arguably probably the more important ones. Our next question is, really, when you think about variability and who reviews movies, we need to know if there are differences in top critics by studio or publication outlet. Now, the publication outlets are really responsible for hiring and sending, but it's important to put these two in conversation together. And what we see on the next slide is if we reduce all 300 films to the top 6, plus Lionsgate, we put all the small distributors into other, and we have in the rows the studios, and in the columns the percentage of critics by identity group. And you can see at the bottom, the very last row, that there is a great degree of stability across each of the studios. I do, because I always think it's important to note when a company is doing well, and I do want to point out that the highest percentage of Caucasian female top critics does go to Universal Pictures. They are tracking at the highest level. More problematically, we see that there is virtual stability across the percentage of underrepresented male top critics in the review pools. And very little variation for underrepresented female top critics across these 7 major companies. So there's a lot of room for improvement in thinking about how do you put together a critics pool, which has some challenges to it, if you read the Deadline article this morning. And they raised those challenges in that piece that I think are fitting to this conversation. So it wasn't only important to look at studio, it was also important to look at how top critics, where they're being assigned from, or the publication venue that they're working at. If you take a look at all the top critics, they come from over 70 different publications. We put each of those publications into one of a few mutually exclusive categories and looked at the proportion of these 4 identity groups working across those outlets. All the definitions of the outlets can be found in the research, so I would suggest looking there so I don't have to waste time going through what each of these categories mean. Again, there is not a lot of variation, but there is some notable deviation to point to. When we look at the entertainment trades, very few white female top critics are getting the opportunity to review, but underrepresented male top critics are at proportional representation, which is important. The reversal is found in general news outlets. And this is one area for advocacy and activism as we tackle this issue collectively as a community moving forward. Now, the most important part of this conversation is what I'm about to present next. When we released our first study, and Academy Award winner Brie Larson made comments at the Women in Film Crystal Lucy Awards, there was a lot of conversation around the relationship between critic and characters' identities and how that affects reviews or critical evaluation. Well, we posed this question in the research. It was actually something we had talked about with Franklin months ago and had to increase our sample size to have enough characters from the 4 different groups to look at differences by critics' reviews. We took the 300 movies and put them into one of 5 groups. Homogeneous white male leads, lead, co-lead, ensemble cast with only white male characters, white female characters, underrepresented males, underrepresented females. If there were any differences among co-leads or ensembles, they were put into an other category. We wanted to match the identity of the leading character with the identity of the critic. We then looked to see, using a standardized score, 0 to 10, based on the information given on Rotten Tomatoes, how critics reviewed these films. I'm only going to show you the results of 2 groups. And a score of 0 to 10, if we were to look at films with white male lead characters, which is on your left, we see that there is no difference in review score by white male reviewers versus underrepresented female reviewers. They evaluate content on average roughly the same. The more important finding here is what's next. When you look at films with underrepresented female leads, underrepresented female reviewers, on average, rate those films higher than white male reviewers. What we're calling the Brie Larson test. Now, what's important here is that this is the difference between rotten and fresh on Rotten Tomatoes. Film reviewers' identities might matter. Now, not every film reviewer gets a score. Actually, a proportion of reviews are missing those scores. So we took this one step further and wanted to look at how, in particular, a critic's identity might impact the reviews of scoring rotten versus fresh. And every review has a rotten and fresh score. And if we look at white male leads, there is no difference in the proportion of white male reviewers and underrepresented female reviewers in the proportion rating those stories as fresh. But once again, when you turn to underrepresented female leads, there is a significant and substantial difference between white male reviewers reviewing or rating an underrepresented female-driven story as fresh versus those written by underrepresented female reviewers. I know it's a lot of words, but you see it on screen and you know exactly what I'm talking about. This is important for two reasons. It suggests not only are the voices of all critics important, and the demography in the world that we live in should match what's going on in the critics space. But secondly, reviewers' identity could be a source of revenue that's currently being missed out on by the major distributors. So the question becomes, the last question, what do we do? How do we fix inequality in the film criticism space? I will leave you with two quick solutions. One, we need to have publication outlets work with studios and make a pledge for 30-30-2020. What does that mean? We know in the United States the population for white males and females is 30-30, underrepresented females and males 20-20. The world in which we live should match who is reviewing these films. Now, if you want to counter-argue and say there's not a talent pipeline, I'll completely disagree with you and see the report for why, because we're out of time. Now, if you want to complain further, Time's Up, who has been our supporter and our partner in this process, along with the Annenberg Foundation, has created a tool called Critical, which is an opt-in database that allows studios, talent, film critic associations, and representatives to find contacts, to find critics from a variety of different backgrounds and groups. And what's really important is that Hollywood can use this tool, publication outlets, studios, to build a diverse community when it comes to reviewing content. And here, critics can actually go on, create their own profiles on the site, indicate their areas of interest, the beats, the festivals that they'll be attending. I know many of the critics in this critical database are here at TIFF. And publicists, studios, and others need to set target inclusion goals to ensure that the world we see here, the world we see in the world in which we live, matches not only the stories that are being told, but also who is reviewing those stories. So on that note, I'd like to say thank you again for TIFF having me. Please, if you want to learn more about the report that we jointly did with Time's Up Entertainment and the Annenberg Foundation, it can be found on our website. And now I'd like to invite up Franklin Leonard, CEO and President of The Blacklist, and our panel.
Am I on? Can you guys hear me? Do I have, yeah, all right, there we go. Thank you all for coming. Let me also start by thanking TIFF and particularly Karina for helping make this panel happen. I also want to take a moment and have you guys give another round of applause to Dr. Smith. Yeah, you know, it is, you don't get a lot of praise for being the bearer of bad news, and especially in Hollywood, you don't get a lot of praise for being an academic and a technocrat, but if you're looking for someone who is doing the real work of the movement, look no farther than she. This work is incredibly important, and it lays bare in a data-driven way the systematic bias that we deal with on all levels of the industry. She's a hero of mine, and I think a hero of many, and for those who she's not, she should be. So thank you, Stacy, for your work.
Thank you.
So we don't have a ton of time, and I wanted to just sort of get into it. So I spared you all my sort of fumbling introductions of everybody, and I thought I'd let everybody introduce themselves with one simple question. You know, tell us how you ended up in film criticism, because I think for a lot of you are probably wondering how you end up in this seat, and I thought it would be valuable to sort of for all of you to tell somewhat quickly your stories of how you ended up here.
Starting with me?
Let's do it.
All right. You know, I feel like growing up, I was always kind of interested in movies, even though my family didn't see that many. So, and I knew I wanted to do something with writing, so film criticism seemed like a natural fit. But how I actually got into it, honestly, it was a lot of luck. Like, I just, when I was happening to look for a job, I happened to know someone who knew someone who was looking for someone. So, I mean, I am proud of everything I've done, but I have to credit, like, luck a lot to getting my foot in the door.
I'm Valerie Complex. I was in the military at the time, and I was bored. I didn't really have much to do. And this one website was like, we're looking for writers. You don't have to have any experience. Just come write, and we love your opinion. And so I signed up, and the first movie review I ever wrote was for Critic. And I just laid into that movie. And I got so many responses, and I was like, I'm making people angry, yes! And then it sort of just took off from there by accident, because even at this particular website, there were problems, there were inclusion problems. And from then, I just started, I've always been on this. So it was something that I've always, you know, diversity and equality is something I've always been for. And so it sort of started there, and here I am, sitting here.
Well, but after the military, I mean, so you started writing reviews while you were still in the service?
Yes.
And after you decommissioned, like, what then? What happens after?
Well, I moved to California, and I went broke, but I still was writing and trying to keep things afloat. But I made some really, really good connections, because after I discharged, I moved from Virginia to California and was like, I'm gonna go out there and I'm gonna make it. And reality slapped me in the face. And I was like, okay, well, I still love to review film, but it's becoming a bit of a burden. So I was like, how can I make it fun again? And then after I left California, I went back home to New York. And as long as it continues to be fun, that's why I continue to do it, because I found it to be a really good, and after the military and trying to adjust, it was one of the things in my life that was still a lot of fun to do.
Wow. Gil Robertson, president of the African American Film Critics Association. You know, I was an A&E journalist, and film criticism was just a natural extension of that work. You know, living, working in Hollywood, interacting with the talent, it was just sort of like a seamless, you know, integration into what I was already doing in covering the film industry.
Jacqueline Coley, and I guess the way I came to film criticism was weird. I was always writing, but I didn't have the luxury when I went to college to say to my mother, as the first person to go to college, I would like to take a creative writing degree. My mother was very much like, you're going to get a business degree and bring us back some money. So I didn't pursue writing, even though that was something that I was always passionate about. And if you're really stealthy, you can find some awful fan fiction of mine from like the early 90s. It's just bad. But criticism came from me.
She's not saying you should look for
Don't.
it.
Yeah. Please don't.
But I guess you could.
You could, I mean, if you're stealthy enough, you could find it. But no, so criticism for me came because, I mean, I'll not just gonna back my employers, but I was on Rotten Tomatoes and I saw some of the things that we all see, and I didn't see someone who liked the same kind of films that I liked the way that I liked them. I didn't see someone that wrote from a female perspective that liked period dramas and musicals and sci-fi stuff the way that I did. And I felt that I was a weird hodgepodge as far as the point of view and the things that I enjoyed. And so it's one of those things that I think a lot of creative people do. When you don't see yourself in the world, just go make it. Mm-hmm. And so I reached out to some publications, just stupidly thinking like, hey, I want to write for you. And I was lucky enough that a few of them, you know, took a chance on me, and a few more took a chance on me. You get more bylines, you meet great folks like everyone on this panel who I've met. And, you know, 4 years later, get to just write for fun, which to me is the biggest con in the face of the earth.
I'm curious. I mean, look, so Dr. Smith has sort of laid bare the reality of the numbers, which is that in any gathering of film critics, it's not going to look like this stage.
No.
Although, you know, what's interesting is that 65% of AFCA's members are black females.
That is interesting, actually. And it might be a testament to your work, though, honestly, Gil, if we're being honest about it. But I'm curious, and Stacy, I'd love to get you to weigh in on this, too, because I know you've done a lot of qualitative research, work along these lines as well, but, like, what are the obstacles that you guys have seen or perceived with your peers that, and we'll put a very fine point on it, that you would not likely have dealt with had you been white men?
Do you want to start with this one?
No. But I do want to say how I got into this space. It was Franklin and Tessa Thompson saying, would you look into it? And I think you should never underestimate the impact of asking a question to an academic on an industry, right?
Yeah.
And that's how it typically happens. You have a question and you start pursuing. But no, I'll let you guys talk about the barriers first.
One thing I don't want to do, I don't want to put you guys in the situation of having to say, well, this would have happened for me if I was a white man, because Lord knows I've been in that situation. What I'm asking more generally is like, what are the examples of the things, you can sort of speak generally about it, that you perceive within the community generally, or what makes your jobs harder, or the opportunities that you see your white male peers sort of getting or being offered that you were like, look, if I had that opportunity, I would knock it out of the park. Yeah. Just, you have my email, hit me up.
It's so funny that you mentioned that, because I think there is an assumption sometimes when you are a person of color and you have a certain identity that you get tracked, is what I like to call. I am like the biggest fan of period piece. You put it on a corset with an accent, I am there. And it was hard for me sometimes pitching to editors, talking to sometimes with publicists about why, when I was writing for a completely POC publication, why I was trying to write to these pieces. I mean, I remember one film I saw at Sundance, had nobody black, had not that many females even in the film, but I loved it. And I hounded these publicists to be like, please let me get the talent, let me talk to them, you don't understand. I've become obsessed about the film and the book it was based off of. But it was a very hard road to go down, because a lot of them didn't understand it, because again, I think a lot of people, it's simple. They're just doing basic math. It's like, okay, we got this film, we got to have this lead, and we're going to have this many people there. But I think there is a widening of interests. Black people are not a monolith. Asian people are not a monolith. There are different various facets, and there's multifacets within diversity, diversity within diversity. And I think that is the hardest thing to deal with, because if you're a white male, they can just assume whatever you like is whatever you like, and they don't pigeonhole you, I feel, as much to whatever track they maybe want to put you down. And I would say that's from, simple things as, moderating panels. I know, it's great that I get to see a lot of my brethren when it has an all-black class. That's when they call me. But hey, I'll moderate the favorite. Anybody from Fox Searchlight? Let's talk about it. But that's the difference right there. Because I think I can bring a perspective, because I think people of color, we have been born looking at white people, looking at people from outside of our identity, and feeling that representation on screen, because we've been forced to. Because if you're looking for representation prior to Sidney Poitier, it just wasn't there. So we've been able to do that. So filtering it through a POC lens, I feel a lot of times makes it even richer. Because again, I think Kumail Nanjiani said at the Oscars, we've been doing it our entire lives.
To expand on that,
Oh, thank you. Do not clap for me. Thank you.
To expand on that, opportunity and access has been the biggest challenge for me, especially as a freelancer.
As I say, as a freelancer, I imagine you deal with this in a very specific way.
Yeah, I apply for jobs all the time, and it's one thing or the other, or they don't have a place, or I've heard we don't have a diversity department. I've heard all kinds of stuff. I've heard all kinds of things, and I think a lot of the time you see more white males working for larger publications. I don't mind working for smaller publications at all, as long as it's paid, but you find white males are hired more and at a faster rate than women or women of color. And when you're at a bigger outlet means more access to publicists, because it means this outlet has higher numbers. And I think that is also something worth exploring. Why is it that people like me have a difficulty finding permanent work in this business? And for example, someone reached out to me talking, about this initiative at TIFF, and what my experience is like being on the red carpet as a black reporter, as a freelancer, and what it's been like securing interviews and stuff. But the person that reached out to me was white, and it was from a major outlet, and I was like, your editor-in-chief has my information. And I just found it interesting that someone white was being able to tell my story and get paid for it. And I was the one that was reached out to for information. So you get my information for free and you go get paid. So that's a lot of what's happening. And so I know some people may see it as me being bitchy, but I just say no, because I am the one experiencing it. So I can give you a story that comes from a personal place, as opposed to someone who's white, who's going to get paid and get the numbers and then go out and have other opportunities while I'm, begging people for things. So that's the other part of it, is wondering why we can't get hired, and looking at the demographics of, the top 100 outlets and who's working there and why it is. And, I feel like a lot of outlets know about it, they just don't give a shit. So, excuse my language, they don't care. And so I think that that's worth exploring.
There's another side to that too, though, because if you end up being that person, and I'm very blessed that this is not my situation, I feel like the folks at Rotten Tomatoes, there was already things in place. But if you're that first Black person, first Asian person, first woman to be hired at a publication, it is a lonely battle.
And the whole world is on your shoulders.
Exactly.
Right.
Every Black issue, you have to be the person that weighs in to what everybody thinks. And I think if some of these publications don't prep themselves, ask themselves questions as to what they're putting in place, they're going to hire that person and they'll be gone in 18 months. And then it sets back the whole movement another 5 years.
And when I started doing this in the time before time, many, many years ago, I was very conscious of being the only one. And literally, you would get into these environments and you were the only one. And understanding that I not only had to represent myself, but the larger community. And it's just a burden that you simply take on.
I think that it's one of the other things that's important is, people like to throw around the word diversity, and I really don't think they know what it means. And because when you say you're looking for diverse writers, it's not just the word. You have to be ready to implement that at your company. You have to be ready to bring in that demographic and have them work on the same playing field as everyone else. Because like Jacqueline said, people will come in and they'll give them every Black movie that comes out, you review it. Or, and anytime you want to break out of that, there's no room to do that. So I think when they ask for that, companies need to be prepared. Because they ask for freelancers, hey, we want a diverse pool of freelancers, but, your email goes in the queue with 100 other people who are trying to pitch to that outlet. So
and the reality is that people like to work with mirrors of themselves. Mm-hmm. And when you're working in an office environment, and given the polarizing nature of race, particularly in the States, and certain things happen. I can recall when I was a music editor at a trade in California during a time when OJ was being, told you it was a long time ago, when the OJ verdict came in, when the Million Man March came in. Those were big issues, and anyone who knows me knows I'm probably the Blackest person on the planet. So I held a particular stance that was unwavering. And so there were tensions. There were tensions that we were fortunately able to navigate, but still in all there were tensions. And I think for a lot of people, which is the reason why we started AFCA, under that pressure, a lot of us will crack. And I really felt strongly that we needed to be able to provide those individuals support while they were trying to navigate those environments.
Angie, do you have anything you want to add?
Just that, throughout my career, it's just been very obvious to me that, if you're a white man, you kind of people give you the benefit of the doubt in a way that I don't get. People assume that, I used to. I'm not being very articulate today, sorry. I used to write a lot about superhero movies and stuff, I still do, and especially something like that. If a 30-something white guy walks on, everyone's just like, that guy knows what he's talking about. If someone like me comes on, I feel like I have to constantly prove myself. I feel like I have to make sure that I know what I'm doing more than they might. I feel like if they mess up or something, that I worry that they're gonna get away with it in a way that I might not be able to, things like that. And then on the other side of it, as you guys are saying, they also kind of are assumed to be objective, quote unquote, in a way that I don't feel like they presume I'm able to be, quote unquote, objective, where, you know, if I want to talk about something that has to do with race or gender or something, they're just like, oh, well, of course you are seeing it that way because, you know, you're an Asian lady, of course you're going to want to talk about that and things like that. So I found that to be such a double-edged sword in my career because it's something that I feel a lot of pressure to speak about, and I am, you know, in a lot of ways happy to be able to speak about. It's something that I do believe in strongly, so I'm glad that I'm able to do the work there. But on the other hand, you know, part of me is also a little bit ambivalent about this burden that, like, you know, I'm sure we've all been in that position where you're just like, well, if I don't talk about this, no one is going to. I might not really want to talk about it, but someone has to, and I guess it's going to be me.
Yeah. I think that, too, when you think about the larger ecosystem, everything in Hollywood is predicated typically on perceived similarity. And so if you have, let's say, an underrepresented lead, then you're more likely to say, well, there has to be an underrepresented director attached, right? And then you say, well, if it's an underrepresented cast, we need to have a critics pool that's a little more diversified. I like to call this adventures in missing the point.
I'm going to steal that, by the way. I'll credit you, but I'm definitely going to steal that.
It's a book title I stole from someone at some point. Right. So, but if we really think about 30-30-20-20, no, it's not a quota, but if you look at my slides, there's an invisible quota working in the industry. So that argument doesn't hold with me at all. If we had proportional representation and gave everyone the opportunity to what Jacqueline was discussing, to have their tastes and preferences by genre and different actors and different directors, then we would see those voices, the cacophony, cry out and allow audiences to vote. And so what TIFF is doing, what Sundance is doing, what Rotten Tomatoes is doing, I really think is an effort to put the power in critics' hands to give audiences the ability to find those voices that they resonate with, follow them, and let's then change the revenue. Because I think these data, and that's the next study we'll be doing, how do these changes in who's reviewing relate to box office performance? And that becomes the kicker, because then the studios can really say there's a business imperative, as we all know already, to making these changes. So we have to uncouple this ridiculous notion of characters, race, or gender dictates everything. That's just nonsense.
Yeah, I actually wanted to dig a little bit more into the idea of diversity within diversity, because, you know, we oftentimes, I think for ease of sort of data analysis, but a more broad conversation, sort of group everything as white and underrepresented, or white and sort of male, female underrepresented. But obviously, within the broad category of underrepresented, there's a lot of other categories if we want to sort of do things that way. And I think that, especially in the United States, the history of racial diversity is oftentimes talked about as sort of a black-white dyad, which we all know is not the case. And I'm curious to have you guys talk about sort of your encounters with diversity outside of that. Now, obviously, three of you are black. So I'm going to start with you, Andy, not to single you out on this, but, you know, we're living in a time where Crazy Rich Asians is crushing the box office, as those of us who were paying attention knew that it would. But can you talk about your experience, sort of like the diversity and inclusion outside of sort of people's default assumptions, which are obviously flawed?
I do feel like because you know, like at my last job, I was the only person who wasn't a white man, and it did feel like it fell on me a lot to write about racial issues. And like, you know, whether they were about like Asian people specifically or just like general, which I kind of found to be, you know, like I said, I'm happy to do the work, but it's also kind of a bummer because it's like, well, so I'm the only, I'm like the default person that has to talk about all of this.
I think, I'm sorry, I just lost my train of thought. I think the most, what was the question again? Jesus, I'm sorry.
No, I just wanted to talk about sort of the diversity within diversity, right?
Oh, yeah.
Like, as a black woman specifically, like how do you deal with that specificity as opposed to just being black or just female? I guess this is a broader question about intersectionality, but it really is just about how do we escape this conversation that is just, oh, it's white or it's black and there's nothing else under the sun, which is obviously not true.
I know a good friend of mine is an Asian journalist with the LA Times, Jen Yamato, and about 3 years ago, we were having a conversation about this very issue, and sought to address it by pulling together collectives of film critics, entertainment journalists from various backgrounds within that space to talk about the various concerns. And we've been working with Project Evolve over at Film Independent for the last few years. We've also been doing an ongoing workshop series with Emerson College. About a year ago, I launched a website called Kaleidoscope Reviews, whose mission is to provide a space for up-and-coming multicultural critics and entertainment journalists. So, yeah, it's real, because every time the conversation is being had, it's being had about us, black people and white people, and you have all these other people within that space sort of getting lost. So it's our way of trying to do a little something to mend that fence.
To answer, my goal has always been to sort of uplift, people from smaller outlets. And like, there are great trans women and trans men who are out there writing reviews, and I don't think that gets looked at enough. There are folks who are part of the disabled community who I know are writing reviews and write great reviews, and that doesn't get looked at enough as well. So I think we have to look at, inclusion and diversity from all intersections, from the queer perspective, disabled, people in the military, mental illness. I think that is what's being ignored now, because I am a black queer woman. So that speaks to one aspect. I'm not just, a black person. I am someone that exists at many intersections. So I think that's important, looking at all those intersections and finding out how we can, utilize that to sort of move ahead.
Yeah, and then even within each category, you have to remember that, like, you can't just be like, oh, LGBT people, they're all the same thing, or like even like black LGBT people are all the same thing. I know, like, as an Asian American, sometimes people try to lump me in with like all Asian people, and I'm like, no, I'm Asian American. That's a specific identity. It's specific to me. It's different from being like a Korean person who lives in Seoul and was born and raised there. And so just like things like that, it always just gets on my nerves when people are like, oh, try really hard to just lump me into one category and just assume that that's good enough.
People love categorizing. It's just like, I think it's our default nature. We want to put, things together. And it's problematic when we talk about representation and identity, because I was speaking to someone the other day about there's representation and then there's more representation, because I was talking about Crazy Rich Asians, but I said, Crazy Rich Asians, when you talk about Asian American representation, they're decades behind the representation we've seen with African Americans. And so if you think that we're thirsty, it is a drought when it comes to Asian Americans. And that's not, it's just that, it's sad, it's very depressing, because... And Latinos, exactly the same thing. So if you're saying to yourself, I am a black girl who likes musical theater and Star Wars, and you want to get this really niche sort of, queer, and like I lived in South Central LA, like that type of representation, to see that on screen, it's going to take that much longer, because Crazy Rich Asians is great, and I think it was an amazing story, but I can guarantee you there's people within the Asian community who you've probably heard and spoke out to that feel like it missed them, because maybe the luxurious aspect of the story off-put them for whatever part of their identity. And that's the same thing from some people that say, if you're, setting your story about, a family where it's all about black pain and we're living in under-supported black neighborhoods, it's like, well, I grew up in the suburbs, so like, I don't know what this is like, I had one of my friends say, well, my family wasn't that close to that, but I felt, I hate to say it now, but we felt more close to the Cosbys, not anything else.
It's funny, I've tweeted periodically that, like, every movie can't and shouldn't represent everybody, but all movies can and should represent everybody. And it's funny, because there was a part of the slideshow, Stacy, that I took particular note of, and it's sort of buried, but the exact quote was in reference to how critics reviewed movies with leads that were underrepresented women. And I think the line on the slide is, due to small sample size for underrepresented female leads, this should be taken with caution.
Absolutely.
And I was hoping to have you comment on that reality And then I've got that as a pivot to another question. But.
Right, and I think for us, we at the Annenberg Inclusion Initiative, we would love to study between group differences and within group differences. But let me just give you the reality of when you have small sample sizes, you have to interpret with caution. These need to be replicated across hundreds of films and independent features as well. But let's just paint the reality of how difficult it is, because we would have loved to look at content with Asian leads. Point me to it, right? We would have, and let me just give you the reality. 1,100 films, 4% of directors are women, only 8 are women of color. 4 black women, 3 Asian women.
That's 8 of 1,100, not 8%.
Right, no. 1,100 films. 1,223 directors, 4% are women, 8 are women of color, 4 black women, 3 Asian women, it's only 2, 1 worked twice, and 1 Latina. We can't do it. On screen, last year, top 100 films, 4 leads were women of color. All 4 were mixed race, right? So we're talking about a fraction of storytelling. And had we had more time, we would have included a much larger sample so that we could start to look at some of those variations within groups. But even with 300 films, you're talking about a finite 400 films, 1 transgender character, 1? Yeah. So I think, research and reality are so different on this issue, and it makes it difficult when there is no variability to study it.
I'm so glad she said that, because we produce an award show annually, and every year, almost without exception, it's almost a default that our Best Actress award goes to a non-black woman. And while we're fine with that, because we recognize the best, it's just we never can find it. It's just not there. And so it's real. It's painfully real. Every single year, it's a big discussion. And we only can give it to what's the sampling that we have to choose from.
This sort of gets to and what I'll make it my final question before we go to the audience. There's probably a school of thought that says, you guys recognize how lucky you are to write about movies for a living. Like, so what? A bunch of white dudes get to write about movies. Like, there are bigger problems in the world. Like, Lord knows there are bigger problems in the world. What is, in your mind, the consequence of a critical establishment that is, where 31 times as many reviews about the top 300 films are being written by white men as by women of color?
I'm not going to pretend that, you're right, this is not the biggest problem we have in this world, of course. But at the same time, movies are art, movies are storytelling, and that's how we understand ourselves, our place in the world, just as people. So when you have a really limited kind of category of people that are always getting to dictate, which stories matter, which stories are important, which stories are good, which stories are fun or interesting or exciting, that really skews our broader population's perspective on which people matter and which things about them matter and which stories matter. So yes, of course, not the biggest issue in the world. I completely understand with that. I completely agree with that. But I will go to bat for this. I think it's very important.
Yeah, I actually agree with you.
Yeah, I'm gonna add. I want to add one more to that, because since we're talking about white male reviewers, I'm going to talk about a good one, which is Roger Ebert, who said quite amazingly, when we look at representation, it is the shortcut to empathy. When we want to have empathy with an identity that you are not familiar, this is not someone that you can maybe find in your town, seeing them represented in a positive and sort of close way on screen allows you to empathize with that person, see that person as a person, and then maybe conduct yourself as a better person for that. Ellen did more for LGBTQIA rights by just being herself on her television show than 1,000 pieces of legislation. So.
I got mad issues. I can handle that one too. I'm not just I got a lot of things going on in my life, and I understand that it may not be the most important thing, but it's something that I think is important, and that's what matters. And nobody on the internet is going to do anything about it. They're not, they can't do anything to me. I'm going to do what I want to do. So I'm going to talk about what I want to talk about, and that's what I want to talk about. So I talk about it, and so I it's something that. It makes them seem desperate, and it makes them seem very scared, like they're being, this form of equality seems like oppression to them. So it's always like, why don't you should have something better to do than complain online. And it's like, I can do what I want, and you're not going to stop me, so whatever.
Exactly. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, like, film criticism is a conversation. That's what's so exciting about it. Why would you want to deprive yourself the opportunity to talk to other people and like find out other viewpoints and like, you know, try to see the world from other people's perspectives? Like, as you said, you know, like movies are about like, you know, that's about empathy, and you're just missing out on so much of the experience of even watching movies if you're only willing to hear certain kind of voices, or if you're only given the opportunity to hear certain kind of voices discuss those films.
All right, questions from the audience? There we go. I think there'll be, I think, one or two microphones heading around. When they hand it to you, stand up so we can see you, and Toronto can capture your beauty for future events. And ask away.
Okay, thank you. A question about the underrepresented category. Dr. Smith was making an argument about the Hollywood films and the leads, but the underrepresented category, without saying Black, Latino, Asian American, Indigenous, for writers doesn't work for me. So I wanted to know if you have any data on that you can share, or if it's on the website. Yes.
On writers, no. I would point to the Writers Guild of America West report every year. They take a look at writers, I believe. With critics, we do have that information, so if you'd like to contact me afterwards, because we did look at different racial and ethnic groups within, but because of the small sample sizes, we did have to collapse into an underrepresented category, so maybe contact me and I can get you some of that information.
The questions? I see one right here.
It's really more of a comment, and we've seen that through Crazy Rich Asians and Black Panther that there is dollars available for ethnically diverse stories. My issue is that I don't think the studio executives who are making these decisions that determine what ends up on screen, that's where we have to start figuring out how do we get through. Because as a woman and people of color, we're not seeing it. We don't see handicapped people. Yep. We don't see all these people become invisible. And it's a very frustrating thing, and I just see, where do we begin to get through to the people making the decisions?
Like Franklin said, I mean, the success, be very clear, that the success of Black Panther and Crazy Rich Asians has the potential to be a game changer in the industry. It'll be interesting to see what happens, because we've seen situations like this before, but I think this time it's going to be a little different.
I hope so. I'm a former studio executive myself. I was an executive at Universal Pictures for several years and actually worked as the junior on Fast and Furious 5, which, if you're looking for an example of a highly diverse film franchise that, you know, is making $1 billion worldwide years before Black Panther, and crushing the box office in China even, despite all of the claims that diverse content doesn't work in China. I think there have been arguments, there have been financial arguments in favor of diversity for as long as film has existed. And the reality is that most of the people who are making the decisions about greenlighting films in Hollywood aren't seeing those films, their immediate social community isn't seeing those films, or they discount their value for any number of other reasons. And I think that part of it is those decision-making bodies need to be increasingly diversified so that people are aware that, you know, how many people realize that the first Mamma Mia movie made $500 million worldwide, or something similar? How many people realize that Slumdog Millionaire did, I think, $270 worldwide? How many people realize that Straight Outta Compton was probably going to do good business foreign, even despite the fact that a lot of people were like, no one outside of the United States wants to watch a bunch of hoodlums from South LA who rap. But, you know, they were also one of the most important musical acts of arguably the most important musical movement around the world over the last 40 years. So I think it's a question of diversifying the people that are making the decisions. But I've said more recently, I very much hope that the people who are in charge and who are intent upon continuing to make decisions that don't reflect the diversity of the world do so as frequently as possible so that they will lose their jobs and or their companies and they can be replaced by people who get it.
I want to add one thing. I mean, usually this conversation goes something like this. This film made money. See, this film made money. So we confound who drives the story with how much money's behind it. It's what's the money behind it that drives success, not who's in the driver's seat of the story. And our statistical models has shown that. We're doing right now in concert with Sundance and Women in Film, the largest economic analysis of who's driving the story, the cast, production, distribution, exhibition factors. There's never been a real study looking at a sophisticated modeling of what would happen internationally or domestically if you were to change some of these factors to actually challenge the decision-making of the studios. But if a story is good, it's going to make money. But more importantly, and that's what our models have shown, you put it in a lot of theaters and you put a lot of money behind it in terms of production and marketing. Doesn't matter who's driving the story. It's going to do well if it's a great story. And so we have to move out this conversation and say, it's about the resources. And so when we release this study in a few months, and we don't know what the findings are yet, but it will be across the last 11 years, you know, we're hoping that it will point to this fact. Move away from making these really ridiculous distinctions about different identity groups and tell a great story, because that's where you'll have the return on investment and put a lot of marketing dollars behind it.
Like I said, doing the important work of the movement.
Hi, first of all, Dr. Smith, I thought the numbers were extraordinarily interesting, and I want to also thank you for separating the female category, because I think sometimes those two things are conflated, and the situation is unfortunately different. I had a question for you, though, around the reaction that the publications themselves may have had to the information. What was their response? I don't know that you addressed that in your presentation.
No, I mean, I think the first study went over very well in June. I think we're at a bit of a saturation effect in terms of this conversation at this point. I know there's a lot of concern about freelance, as there should be. We need a large-scale study looking at the barriers and opportunities for freelance critics in the pipeline. We know the problems are there, but I think that's a self-report survey that needs to be done with people in those occupations. We've gotten some good traction from the trades today. The most important findings, though, were those last ones that I put up on the screen, a reviewer identity by lead identity in terms of critic scores. Those are the things that are the most important, because they really show this could drive performance at the box office. And so I don't know to what degree those findings have been picked up. I haven't really read too many of the articles. I looked at the Deadline one this morning. So I guess it's to be determined how much traction this will get. But we're not going to stop until it changes. So that, rest assured.
I mean, really quickly, I can tell you, you know, I'm, you know, sort of in league with quite a few outlets, and you know, online they've all been really supportive of the movement and are really happy that it's happening, yet they sit in offices with all white people, and there's a lot of performance going on, and there's not a lot of movement, because people are probably just, you know, it's convenient and they just like the way things work. But that's something to also watch out for, people who talk the talk and do nothing else because it makes them look good. Right. It was hilarious when Black Panther was coming out to see these outlets scramble for writers to write about Black Panther. I thought it was so funny, because it's like, you wouldn't have this problem if, you know, you hired someone.
Right. Let's be honest, we were so popular that month.
Yeah.
I talked about I will never be this cute. I mean, no, this is again a joke.
And it was, you know, that was great, but we need that to be happening every day, every month, every year, instead of, you know, during Black History Month or Women's Month or, you know, whatever. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for sharing your information. It's amazing. But I was wondering something. I have a good following online, and I tweet, Instagram, whatever, a lot about film, because this is my passion. And I started writing about, because I love superhero films. So the Avenger, the second one, I didn't like the way they represent the character of the Black Widow. So I wrote something about that. And then everybody was writing, oh, you're just a mean feminist, blah, blah, blah. And I wrote, because I'm French-Canadian, so I wrote a lot about diversity in Quebec. And French-Canadian film, there's no diversity. There's nothing, not even a girl with brown hair. It's that crazy. And I wrote something, and in Quebec, like the response I had, it was crazy. People were saying, in French, that I am a mad Black woman, and but how do you write criticism, like, how do you write things about film, being a Black woman or Asian woman, without people saying, oh, you're just mad, you know what I mean? Like, don't look like you're just crazy.
No. This is an excellent question, and thank you for bringing it up. Because I think that the other part that we haven't discussed is the reality of being particularly a woman of color who, in criticism, on the internet, in the world of social media. And the responses that you often have to deal with, whether you like something or dislike something. And I'm curious if you guys could talk about that, both the reality of the experience, but also how you survive it for the benefit of other people here who may be experiencing the same thing.
Mute and block are a wonderful thing. I will just put that out there. And I'll leave, as a Black woman on the internet, having an opinion, you'd be mad about something every day. And you can have someone coming at you every day. I try to make sure that I put my opinion for things that are necessary. So when I need to insert myself, I do, and I just try not to let them bother me. Because if you are having people come at you because of your point of view, just because you're putting it into the conversation, that has nothing to do with you, and you're never gonna stop those people. Do not let them concern you. So continue to do you.
I had, it seemed to happen every year. In 2016, I didn't like La La Land. People thought I should die. And then I didn't like the Florida Project, and people thought I should die. So the people argue online like nobody's gonna beat my ass. So if you think that you don't like my opinion, okay, then I like to try, like mute and block is good too, but I'd like to see people try. I'm just gonna, be me. Yes, I am Black. Yes, I am a woman. And yes, I am angry. So I embrace it, and it doesn't bother me. And, everybody reacts to it differently, and I appreciate the different ways people go about it, block, mute, confronting people. But I just, I'm gonna be me, and people are not going to always like it, and that's okay. They can sit with that discomfort and deal with it on their own. I am moving on. So, yeah.
All right.
Also, never read the comments.
Yeah. That is a good rule for life. I'm actually asking, the clock I'm seeing here suggests that we are 2 minutes over, but we got time for one more, and then we'll do final thoughts.
So this isn't directly about the study, but I think it ties in and has a direct correlation. I'd like to know, as diverse critics, what you think about the Academy Awards decision in the year of Black Panther to decide to have the most popular award.
Well, that's been canceled.
No.
Canceled.
Oh, it has?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh my God.
Yeah, girl.
While you're on the
No,
flight.
this is
I
okay
was
though.
like, I didn't read my trades.
No,
I'm sorry.
no.
I didn't do my homework.
But you know what, though?
It's
I
coming
could have
back.
gone in for it, but if they didn't cancel it, because the people at the Rotten Tomatoes office knew. They announced that, and I was like, this is a
good.
betrayal. But no, they canceled it. It was, but yeah,
Well,
thank
then
the
good news.
Lord.
I wanted to end on a good news.
Yeah,
As of,
postponed.
I believe, yesterday. Right?
Yeah.
So, all right, final thoughts. Anything else you guys would like to add individually? And then, Stacy, I have a specific final question for you.
I just want to add, if any of you guys are film critics and, for example, maybe this is your first TIFF, maybe you're part of the Share Her Journey, and you haven't reached out to us at Rotten Tomatoes, we did this refresh of our critics criteria, which I think removes a lot of barriers that a lot of folks had to become part of that critical consensus and that critical community. I highly encourage you guys to apply, because I can tell you for myself, when I met with these folks 2+ years ago, they were saying, you already are doing the work to be part of our site, to be on our tomato meter, and I, for some reason, because we all in marginalized communities feel this imposter syndrome, like you don't belong and you're not supposed to be there because you walk into the room and you're the only one there. I would just encourage everyone to please do it, because, again, the critical conversation is just so much better the more people are involved.
Yeah, I want to invite everyone to Kaleidoscope Reviews. We're always looking for new writers. And so if you're Asian or Hispanic or Muslim or Black, obviously, we definitely have a home for you. And we also have a team of journalists who are willing to work with you and help you shape your stories and walk you through the process of being an A&E journalist and film critic. And you can find out information by going to the Kaleidoscope Reviews site.
Stay true to your character. I remember a lot of people, as I was, in the years that I've been in this, people have told me I'm too loud, I'm too this, I'm too that. I am also at TIFF on stage, and they're not. So I think it's important to. I've always talked about diversity and equality, and I'm going to do that no matter what. And I've stuck to my guns, and I believe that that's why I am here today, and I will continue to stick to that. I also want to thank Karina for having me here. I want to thank Share Your Journey, Franklin, who's been a really great mentor to me, and Brie Larson and Angela Robinson, because without them I wouldn't be here right now for their help. And you can also follow me on Twitter at Valerie Complex.
Well, we've talked a lot about diversity within diversity within diversity, and I guess I just wanted to say, I know it's going to take a long time before we are even close to getting close to getting parity or whatever, but don't settle. Like the white guy critics, there's, sorry, I'm gonna think about how I want to say this. You were talking about how there aren't necessarily movies for people who are, you're like, oh, you're a Black woman who likes Star Wars and musicals. There's necessarily going to be a movie for or about someone like me or something like that. But I'm like, white guys get every flavor of white guy story that they could possibly want to see. So I feel like I know it's gonna be forever until we get there, but I want to kind of remind myself and remind all of us, I guess, to not settle for less. I'm not happy with Crazy Rich Asians being the only representation I get, or even Searching being the only representation I get. I want to keep going until I see every kind of story out there about every kind of person.
Yeah.
Keep it up. Stacy, you had the first and deserve the final word. What's next? I mean, you mentioned it, but what's next in terms of the analysis that you guys are working on, and final thoughts?
World domination.
Happy to join you on that mission.
No, I think what's next is we really need to elevate all voices in the pipeline, and I don't mean pipeline as in young rising talent. I mean the pipeline, the C-suite, studio execs, publication outlets, working in concert for three things: diversity, inclusion, and like I said, the North Star is belonging. Enough is enough. And so we need a strategy and a plan, because I'm impatient. And I don't want this to go on to perpetuity when it could be fixed in a few years. So I think accelerated pressure and change, and giving the folks the tools, both economically and a strategy, to get there as fast as possible.
Say no more. Very good. Can we just walk up?
Thank you all so much. Awesome, you guys. Awesome. We are with you. Now let's go drink outside and keep this conversation going. Thank you, Rotten Tomatoes, for sponsoring, and thank you to the esteemed guests. Thank you.